Hello, everybody. Welcome to Ancient Modern. Today, it's a great honor to have with me Walter Scheidel. Walter is the Dickason Professor in the Humanities at Stanford. And Walter, I was looking back through your career and I just listed some of the things you've written about. So demography, epidemics, inequality, family structure, fall of Rome, comparative ancient history, especially Rome and China, the ancient economy. So a lot of stuff. Maybe we could just start by asking you, why do you write about the topics that you write about? What drew you into these particular topics?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. The short answer is I guess I have a short attention span, so I'm not a person who wants to spend their entire career on a single topic. I like to go from A to B to C. Yet I think they're connected because from the very beginning, I was interested in, you know, what used to be called daily life. I mean, the lived realities of people on the ground, of normal people, not big men or wars or history of ideas, but the actual lived experience, what we would call social economic history, health, health and wealth, so to speak. All the things that really concern most people most of the time. And I think that's the connective tissue that binds together the various things that I've been working on.
You also have strong views about methodology, though, don't you? You've been trying to sort of introduce more social scientific methodology into classics and ancient history.
That's certainly true. I'm not a big fan of the traditional mode of just, essentially learning all the ancient sources by heart and drilling down in great detail. That's part of the process. But I think it's also really important to be broad, not just deep, but broad, to branch out, look at other historical periods, not just antiquity, and look at what people in other fields are doing, in social science fields, as you say, economics, political science, sociology, anthropology, whatever happens to be useful for what you are interested in, for what you're trying to study and to understand.
Okay, so one example of your application of social scientific methods is Death on the Nile, if we go right back towards the beginning of your career. So this is a book from 2001. It is not an Agatha Christie murder mystery. It's in fact a book about ancient epidemics. So what drew you to that topic? What were you trying to do in that book?
We had to ask the Agatha Christie estate whether we can use the title, and they figured an academic book wouldn't sell any copies, so they were fine with it. Anyway, so the idea was to look at living conditions in ancient Egypt in the first millennium, really of the common of the Christian era, Roman Egypt, Byzantine Egypt, and early Islamic Egypt as well, looking at how demographic conditions were shaped by the disease environment. And that really brought together two fields that were usually and still are often studied separately. Historical demography on the one hand, history of disease and medicine on the other. And I figured you couldn't really understand the specifics of demography of life and death in any region of the world, such as Egypt, without looking at the disease environment. And of course, Egypt is a special case because the evidence is very rich. We have the papyrological record telling us about people's daily lives. There's a fairly rich epigraphic legacy as well, thousands of epitaphs, tombstone inscriptions that are used to establish above all the seasonal distribution of death. Now, this may sound terribly arcane. It's something we are no longer that used to because in modern populations, there is some variation from one month to the next in terms of overall mortality levels, but it's actually quite modest. In the past, there were massive fluctuations between seasons, and they were driven by infectious disease. And based on which seasons were the deadliest ones, we are able to reconstruct with some degree of confidence what infectious diseases or what combination of infectious diseases would have been common in that particular region. And that's very important because there are no statistics, right? People didn't have mortality statistics at the time. They didn't know which diseases killed them. They couldn't even describe them in modern terms. And we, 2000 years later, are actually able to look at these seasonality profiles and use them to reconstruct indirectly the disease environment of a region such as ancient Egypt. And I thought that was a very interesting thing to do.
So I read a couple of reviews of the book, and then some sort of hard-boiled skeptics were saying, well, it's just a seasonal pattern of mortality. It's consistent with these diseases you talk about in the book, diarrheal diseases, dysentery, typhus, typhoid, malaria, possibly smallpox, bubonic plague. is it also just consistent with a seasonal pattern of death that isn't caused by these diseases? I think that's what some of the real skeptics were saying.
Yeah, I mean, not really. I mean, I also looked at early modern records in a way, European travelers in particular going to Egypt, and they reported the same thing still, that if you were in Egypt in the spring, it was a really bad time to be there because you're much more likely to die. And that was consistent with the observations that I made when I looked at the ancient material. And then over time, you can see how the disease environment changes in the 19th century, early 20th century in response to preventative medicine and all kinds of modernization measures that change conditions on the ground. So we are dealing with a disease environment we can trace back 2,000 years. It was still more or less in place 200 years ago. And that, I think, adds a degree of robustness to my reconstruction. And again, that's something that I've always been extremely interested in, how ancient conditions compare to conditions in different periods. And that's a good example of how once you bring in comparative data, you can either support or qualify whatever you found in the ancient evidence itself.
Right. So, I mean, a lot of your evidence is from a bit later, right? So you got Coptic epitaphs from the 8th to the 10th centuries AD. You were talking about early modern travelers' evidence. And then I guess you're ultimately interested in sort of the sort of longue durée, right? You're interested in sort of Egypt over the long term. So to what extent can you retroject that kind of seasonal pattern of mortality onto ancient Egypt and the ancient world?
Well, Egypt, as is well known, is a fairly unique case because of its ecology, right? It's driven up to about 1900 by the annual inundation of the Nile that floods all the land, which is good for agriculture. It's not so good for people's health because, of course, it creates all kinds of, certain pathogens and parasites will flourish under those conditions. It's just a trade-off that people had learned to live with in that particular region. But that's an ecological system. It's fairly stable all the way up to the various Aswan dams that were set up in the course of the 20th century, the old one around 1900, and then the big modern one more recently. And it was really the first time this environment changed significantly in that regard. So the assumption of long-term continuity is, in this particular case, quite a reasonable one. And then, of course, in addition, you have an overlay of epidemics that may come in at certain times, like smallpox or later on bubonic plague. Plague is mostly a post-ancient phenomenon in that part of the world, so I didn't have to worry too much about it. And it's not something that would necessarily be visible in the kind of sources that I use, the tombstones or the mummy labels, for instance, because if you have mass mortality, people don't usually get nice, fancy tombstones, right? They're put in mass graves. They have to be disposed of rapidly without much ceremony. So we wouldn't necessarily see those pandemics in the written records anyway.
So I read your book along with my students in 2020 or 2021, I think, when I designed a new honors course based on epidemics, because you may remember epidemics were in the news in 2020 and 21. Um, so if you're right about plagues in Egyptian history, what does your book tell us about plagues and civilizations in general?
It shows us that, at least at the time, and maybe this hasn't changed so much, people are very much at the mercy of the environment, right? Of whatever the pathogen distribution, prevalence, frequency is in a certain part of the world. And that it's only been very recently that we have found means of pushing back against this, right? And leading lives that are significantly less encumbered, less burdened by this kind of disease environment. But that's a very fragile accomplishment, right? If you think of, ongoing mutation, all these pathogens aren't just sitting there waiting for us to, suppress them. They evolve continuously and may well stage a comeback, which again, as you just said, we discovered about 5 years ago. And if there's one thing to be sure of is that there'll be more such incidents in the future waiting for us.
Okay, we're going to change tack slightly. We're going to talk about another book you wrote, this one from 2017, Great Leveler, Violence and the History of Inequality from the Stone Age to the 21st Century. It does actually include plagues in it, and we'll come back to that. But so the way I understand it, this book is kind of a take on Piketty's famous book about capital. And his thesis is basically that the returns to capital are always going to be superior to the returns to wages. In other words, if you are someone who has capital and you can invest it, you're going to get greater returns over the long term, or your descendants are, than people who are just struggling to make a living by working. And so the thesis suggests that, all things being equal, inequality is going to keep increasing over the long term. And I think already for Piketty, he sort of suggests there are only a few things that can actually reduce inequality. You can have super high rates of taxation, I think he talks about, I think he's a proponent of. You can also have civilizational breakdown, wars, and things like that. So uh, you talk about these four horsemen that you call them of leveling. So mass mobilization warfare is one, transformative revolutions is the other one, state collapse, and catastrophic plagues. So yeah, so do you think that this is something which has happened with COVID?
Huh. Well, before I answer that, let me just go back to something I briefly mentioned earlier. I mean, it's about method, right? So I've always been interested in inequality, distribution of wealth, income, and so on. So the book comes out, I read the book, it's about the last 200 years, and I think, wait a minute, very persuasive, but what about the rest of history, right? Most of history. Is this applicable? I thought so. And I was able to show that it was. So that shows how important it is to really look beyond, the ancient material and always be on the lookout for inspiration in other areas and periods. As for COVID, I was asked, unsurprisingly, at the time, because when my leveler book came out in 17, I said, maybe somewhat foolishly, well, maybe there won't be any major pandemics waiting for us in the near future. Little did I know. A few years later, COVID comes along. Luckily or unluckily for me, journalists remembered. They all came back for a second helping, saying, is COVID going to be a great leveler? And already, I think in the spring of 2020, I said no, for a number of reasons. The most obvious reason is, well, to put it, crudely, not enough people are dying, right? This is nothing like the Black Death. The Black Death would carry off a third of all people. That's not the case with COVID. And the people who did die were mostly, not all of them, but primarily elderly people who are no longer part of the workforce. So you wouldn't actually get the kind of Black Death effect, which was really a massive labor shortage. If you kill a third of all people across all different age groups, you're going to get a serious labor shortage. With COVID. That was not the case. We did, however, this is actually quite interesting, get similar effects on a minuscule scale. If you remember back when the economy reopened, whenever it was, I mean, varied by country, I guess it took a little longer in New Zealand, 21, 22, there was temporarily a bit of a labor shortage because, not because of mortality, but because people had left jobs they didn't like, or they took early retirement, or they had to take care of relatives or their children because the schools were still closed, and so
Or
on.
people
And
couldn't
you
get
could
into the country.
see
I mean, that was in New Zealand too, I
yeah,
think, one of the
yeah,
effects.
exactly.
Yeah.
And you could see a very modest effect. It wasn't like the doubling or tripling of real wages like you would see in the 14th century, 15th century, but there was a noticeable increase in real incomes, especially for people in the lower range of the income distribution. It was not to last, right? It lasted maybe for a year or thereabouts, and then inflation kicked in and ate up, these gains that had been made on that front. But you could still see a faint echo of the kinds of effects that you would see on a much bigger scale, let's say in the late Middle Ages. So no, COVID wasn't a big leveler. It was a tiny leveler, maybe for a very limited amount of time, but ultimately for similar reasons.
Yeah, I found an article by Angus Deaton, the famous economist, not the English comic actor, and he finds it's a complex picture, but he seems to think inequality did go down during COVID.
It did go down till, inflation really kicked in, and then all of a sudden, it wasn't quite like that anymore. Of course, the other aspect was governmental intervention, right? The subsidies that were on the payouts, the payments that were sent to households directly in many countries. Of course, that's something you didn't have in pre-modern societies. So that's a buffering mechanism that wasn't available in the past. But it also really helped mitigate the effects of COVID. And in a way, any number of things were present that stabilized the existing order, which I think is very important. Because in pre-modern societies, if a really massive plague struck, you know, established institutions were in big trouble. Governments, monarchies, the church, landowners, you name it. In 2020, you had strong governments in most parts of the world. You had redistribution, you had welfare systems, You had quantitative easing, right, with infusion of liquidity into the system. And you had what we are doing right now. We had Zoom, right? You have Zoom so that a significant share of the workforce can continue to work. Students can go to school, not very well, arguably, but at least to some extent. So then again, that's a major buffering mechanism. And then, of course, you had modern medicine and the RNA medications, and all these modern things come together in mitigating whatever effect COVID might otherwise have had.
So
It would
that,
never have killed enough people, but it could have destabilized the economy
yeah.
much more,
So
and
that's
therefore also political systems.
yeah, I mean, that's all very reassuring because I mean, no one really wants civilizational collapse, but this is where your book's a bit paradoxical, right? Because it seems to suggest with Piketty that if everything just remains stable, then that's all very nice for the people living in these civilizations, but inequality is going to keep producing, right, until it reaches maybe pathological levels. So, does your book suggest in a way that we kind of need disasters every now and then?
Well, it doesn't advocate disasters. I think the rather gloomy conclusion is that if disasters are the only truly effective way of significant, not marginally, but significantly reducing economic inequality, then yes, in some sense, we might need those disasters for inequality to really go down big time, which of course doesn't mean that we should want those disasters to occur because they are disasters, right? And they spread misery and kill lots of people and destabilize lives and so on. And that's probably not worth it. So at the end of the day, if we really had to choose, we don't get to choose, but if we had to choose, let's say, between a World War II or Black Death scale disaster and high levels of inequality, I'm pretty sure what I would choose.
Let's talk a little bit more about World War II because that's a really interesting case because I think it sort of informs a lot of the way that we think about inequality. Maybe not so much my generation, but definitely my parents' generation. That, in Canada and also countries like Britain and to a certain extent the United States, I mean, inequality was historically low, but we kind of grew up taking that as a normal situation, right? And in fact, I mean, I think your work and other work suggests that it was a very unusual situation precisely because World War II was so destructive, right?
That's very true, but whatever you grow up with is normal for you, right? So you have a couple generations for which this was the new normal. There was, some faint sense it had been different in the past, right? But now it was like this. And then, of course, the expectation is it's always going to be this way, right? We always have low levels of inequality and strong unions and a functioning welfare state and jobs and growth at all at the same time. And that turned out not to be the case, or arguably not sustainable in the long term.
Okay, let's go right the way back to ancient history now, so or even pre-ancient history. So the one view that people have of history is that we were all hunter-gatherers at some point. It was very utopian, everyone was equal. Then, we started plowing, we started to have surplus material, we started to produce wealth, and then all hell breaks loose. Is that something that you think is accurate from your look at the evidence?
If you put it in very broad terms, the way you just did, yeah. If you look for exceptions and variation and so on, you'll find it, right? It depends on what kind of farming regime you have. It depends on whether you use plows or whether you have smaller animals or no domesticated animals and what kind of implements and whether you rely on irrigation or rainfall or this or that. So once you go into the details, there's a great deal of real life variation. That's fair to say. But if you take several steps back and you take what is it, the Jupiterian perspective that I think Macron talked about once, you look at it from really up high, then that's the basic outline of development. Those are the basic dynamics. It doesn't mean that these things unfold in a linear fashion, in a completely predictable fashion. There are detours. There's regression. People may give up farming for extended periods of time for whatever reason. But by and large, you could say wherever farming took hold and certain, attendant institutions, property rights and inheritance systems and so on that would conserve and distribute private property. In all these areas, even if there were detours and intermissions in the very long term, you see fairly stable regimes of inequality. And then there are other parts of the world where these things just never happened, like in Aboriginal Australia, for instance, because ecological conditions are very, very different. But if you look at those parts of the world where most people lived and already did hundreds of thousands of years ago, that's where you see really stable inequality regimes emerge and survive in the long term.
Right. Okay. So in the parts of the world where they discover agriculture. I mean, think about the ancient Near East where agriculture was first discovered. Then after the so-called Neolithic Revolution, you get basically the rise of complex states. You get these very complicated civilizations with these, massive temples and big public works and sort of godlike kings and all the rest. That is kind of, a nightmare of inequality in a sense, but it's also sort of the price of civilization, or so it seems. So that's one part of the story. But then it also seems like you get into ancient Greece and Rome, particular what I used to study when you were my professor, classical Athens. Are those regimes a little bit more egalitarian?
Yeah, and they're not the first ones. I mean, this is something like Ray Van Wenger talked about in The Dawn of Everything, right? You look at the very beginning of urban civilization, state formation. There are systems that look a little more egalitarian. If you think of the Indus Valley civilization 4,000 years ago, what is now Pakistan, big cities, monumental building, no sign of hierarchy, no sign of monarchy. Very odd by our standards. Similar in Teotihuacan in central Mexico a couple thousand years ago. So there are experiments early on with what we will call traditionally civilization, but without high levels of inequality. And they last a certain amount of time and they invariably fail. And they tend to be replaced by more traditionally unequal systems. But people try. It's a clear indication people are very happy with highly unequal outcomes. They try to break out, but more often than not, they can't do it for more than a certain period of time. When you fast forward another 1,000 years, you have a massive collapse. Goes back to the leveler theme, right? The Bronze Age collapse, or the palace systems in Mycenaean Greece. They're carried away by whatever factors. People will debate this till the end of time. It's probably a multiplicity of factors, but there is clearly a great abatement in terms of centralization, output, control over people, over land, and so on. By the time the dust settles, you have a different political ecology, right? You have hundreds of very small settlements known as the polis, the Greek city-states, and they happen to be less unequal, which in a way isn't that surprising, right? Because, well, they're fragmented, they are poorer, they have gone through this equalizing kind of shock. What is interesting, though, is that those polis then develop institutions that preserve this early egalitarianism for some time, not indefinitely, but for a very considerable amount of time, like half a millennium, at least by some count. That's a huge amount of time by any historical standard, even though all of a sudden you have population growth and economic growth and all kinds of things that would ordinarily be conducive to rising inequality, and yet institutions and ideologies are put in place to not completely keep it from happening, but to keep a lid on it for a long period of time.
Right, yeah, and it strikes me that so you get the Bronze Age collapse, the sea peoples sweep through, and then gradually you get a sort of renaissance, but it looks very different in different parts of the ancient Near East, which used to be a kind of united cultural area. And you look at the Assyrian or the Neo-Assyrian empires, it starts up again. And people like Tiglath-Pileser III were not Marxists, right? And in Greece, you get something very different, as you say. So is this actually a sign that Greek civilization is actually kind of special and unique and interesting?
Um, the short answer is yes. Then the question is why, right? Is it so special in that and in other respects because of some, I don't know, inherently Greek kind of thing? Is it the political fragmentation that's very intense and long-lasting? Is it some other aspect? Is it some combination of factors? I think that's what makes ancient Greek history really interesting, not just for ancient historians, but in general, right? That's a kind of phenomenon that historians and political scientists should study more, consistently, in a way, not because of the glory that was Greece and, traditional notions of, historical heritage and legacies and so on, but as a historical phenomenon, as something that is quite anomalous in global historical terms. And when a lot of work has been done, but we still don't have, I think, a fully, a compelling answer to that question.
Oh, well, let's tie this into something else you've written about. You've written articles about this. I'm not sure if you've written a book about monogamy and polygamy and family structure, so getting slack, Walter. But maybe just explain to people because I've read some of the research on this, but it may not seem obvious or intuitive to people. In what sense is monogamy and family structure, monogamy or polygamy, related to questions about equality and inequality?
That's a good question. So in a way, polygamy, if one sex, usually men, have, multiple spouses, multiple women, that's a very intense form of inequality. Because unless there are many more women than men in a given society, if it's not usually the case, it means there are men who miss out. They don't have any spouses and they can't have children and households and so on. So that's a very, very stark form of inequality. And yet it's one that is very widespread historically. We have, and when I say we, I don't just mean you and me, the world, or much of the world, has become so westernized and modernized that we tend to take normative monogamy for granted. There are only some pockets in the Middle East, in sub-Saharan Africa, where it's not quite the case, but otherwise, majority of people on earth would look at this and say, well, people may not be effectively monogamous, right? They have affairs and all kinds of things, and they get divorced and have serial monogamists, but normative monogamy is the way to be. You go back in time 2,000, 2,500 years, the world is latently polygamous, right? All societies we know about are more or less polygamous, except the Greeks and the Romans. Why is that? I honestly don't know. But it's important to, observe that phenomenon, try to make sense of it, and then track how this expanded gradually over time, which is actually a fairly recent phenomenon, if you think about it. Now, it is a mark of inequality. And as we said, ancient Greeks are a bit unusual in that they are more egalitarian, more overtly egalitarian, and they're also normatively monogamous. No matter how rich and powerful you are as a guy, you can't have more than one wife. That seems obvious to us. It's not at all obvious elsewhere. The richer and more powerful you are, the more, it doesn't have to be wives, consorts, co-wives, secondary wives, whatever you call them, you are going to accumulate, whether it's the Middle East or South Asia or East Asia or the Americas, you name it, or even people in Europe, north of, what was going to be the Roman Empire. It's a very widespread phenomenon into the Middle Ages in medieval Ireland, places like that. It's standard practice. So there is something about an egalitarian ethos that manifests not just in the economic sphere, but also in the political sphere with respect to, participation, democracy, military mobilization. There's a democratized military system at work as well. And it very crucially extends into the private sphere, into family and household formation. And one could say that's the single most important thing, right? I mean, that's the primary focus of people's lives is their families and their households. And if you have more egalitarian structures there has to be some kind of connection, some kind of feedback loop between that and what goes on in the public sphere as well.
Right, that's interesting. So one book that's influenced me greatly in the past few years is Joseph Henrich, The Weirdest People in the World. And that's kind of a grand theory of Western civilization. And he puts a lot of emphasis on family structure and monogamy in particular. Monogamy as one of a package of what he calls, I think, the marriage and family program that he sees as sort of inculcated by the Western Church. And I think, I mean, as you've been saying, it does seem to have spread to the modern world via Christianity or Christian nations. But it sounds like you think that Henrik doesn't take the story back far enough. He thinks it's very much a Christian thing. Obviously, Christianity grows up, is born in the ancient Greco-Roman, Judeo-Greco-Roman world. But you think that actually this practice of sort of equality in the family goes back to Rome, the citizen culture of Rome, and also democratic Athens. Is that right?
Yeah, in fact, Joe and I have had a conversation about this for a great many years, and we agree on most things, but not quite on this. In fact, we were once witnesses for opposing parties in a constitutional case in your native Canada, actually, one of the Western provinces, can't remember which one, about whether, polygamy should be legalized for, various technical reasons and so on. And he thought, well, polygamy is always bad. And I thought, well, it depends on circumstances. Anyway, so the real question is whether it was the Christian church from late antiquity onwards or the Middle Ages that is instrumental in spreading monogamy. And yes, of course, it was instrumental in spreading monogamy. But the question is whether it's sort of an invention of the Christian church or whether the church, what the church does is it takes a well-established Greco-Roman Mediterranean custom, absorbs it into its own belief system, and then pushes for it later on. That would be my thesis, and that's pretty well attested. If you look at the early Christian texts, they're not very concerned about people being polygamous, probably because it's not a big deal. Not that many people are polygamous in the Greco-Roman Mediterranean. So there's nothing to worry about. They are opposed to divorce and people remarrying and all these various things, but not about polygamy per se. So it's not much of an issue. And that's a sign that Christianity grows up in an environment that's already normatively monogamous for the most part. And so it becomes sort of naturally almost part of Christian doctrine. And it's only when the Christians encounter guys elsewhere, rising Islam, or before that the Persians, or the people in Northern Europe or in Eastern Europe who are openly polygamous, they say, wait a minute, that's not Christian, right? There's something wrong with this. We have to do something about this. But they're really just continuing Greco-Roman customs in that respect.
It is fair to say, though, isn't it, that Christianity tightens monogamous norms to an extent, right? Because in
Yes.
Athens and in Rome as well, a man could only have one wife, but he also could have dalliances on the side with younger citizen males, usually prostitutes and so on. And I think this is something that Tom Holland stresses in his book Dominion on the History of Christianity, that one of the things that Christianity does is basically extend the norm of fidelity from wives to husbands, right? So in ancient Athens, if you're a wife and you're messing around, you're in big trouble. If you're a husband and you're messing around on the side, as long as you're not getting married to somebody else, you're fine. So that is a change, isn't it?
That's a big change. And I think to some extent it has something to do with the complex of slavery in the Greco-Roman world, I think, which is possibly a missing variable in a way. It's easier for rich Greeks and Romans to be normatively monogamous if they have access to enslaved women with whom they can do whatever they want. As you say, there's no penalty for that. It doesn't infringe on anybody's honor because slaves don't have honor by definition in that system. The wives are supposed to look the other way. And that's probably how the system worked. So Greeks and Romans are effectively polygynous with respect to their enslaved female subordinates. But, technically, normatively, that allows them to be monogamous. And when this complex, starts falling apart at the end of antiquity, everything gets sort of, remixed in a way. And it becomes more difficult for men to have it both ways, so to speak. And that's when the medieval Christian tightening comes in as well.
All right, that's a perfect segue to the next book of yours that I wanted to talk about, which is 2019's Escape from Rome, The Failure of Empire and the Road to Prosperity. So it's a perfect segue because effectively this book is about the fall of the Roman Empire, right? But it's also about what you call the Great Escape, which is the escape of sort of humanity into industrial modernity, into this sort of vast increase in prosperity that we see. I used to show my students in the first year a graph of estimated GDP over time, and it basically, people have probably seen this. It just sort of goes along. Nothing much happens in economic history for most of human history, and then suddenly it just explodes with the Industrial Revolution. So what's the link in your view between the fall of the Roman Empire and how we got to this sort of great escape from poverty and misery?
Right. So there's an absolutely humongous literature, of course, about why Europe pulled away from everybody else in the last couple hundred years, and you get this kind of great divergence that then, of course, captures the entire globe and, reconfigures power relations in the world and creates the world we live in now. Now, this goes back a very long time. It used to be, I don't know, Europeans are Christians and it makes them better. And then it was Europeans are white, so they're superior to other people. And then you have the more academic explanations. Is it institutions? Political institutions, legal institutions, economic institutions? Is it the environment? Is it chance? Is it the resources captured in the new world? Is it technology, a culture of inventiveness, all of the above, et cetera, et cetera, et
Because
cetera,
China
right?
was further away from America than Europe was,
It's any
geographical.
argument you can
Yeah.
possibly think of has been made many times and critiqued, and there are hundreds of articles and dozens of there are books about all the books and articles that have been written about this. Anyway, so I've been very interested in this for a long time, and I looked at this sort of a little bit as an outsider, and it occurred to me that about 99% of these explanations share a common root, and the common root is that whatever people privilege, the institutions or the inventiveness or the extra-European resources, the exploration, colonization, all these things, they have a common root. And the common root is competitive polycentrism. The fact that post-Roman Europe is fragmented both within and without the various states. So there's no single empire in Europe, west of Russia, after Rome. There's some ephemeral ones that call themselves empires, Charlemagne and the Ottonians, but they don't really work particularly well. There's some extremely short-lived ones that last about 5 minutes, like Napoleon or the Third Reich. But by and large, you have enduring polycentrism in Europe and also great fragmentation within the post-Roman states between people, groups, constituencies that control different kinds of social power, political power, military power, economic power, religious power. You have knights in their castles, you have merchants in autonomous cities, you have bankers, you have priests, you have the church, the pope, any number of things, right? So it's an endless process of competition, of compromise, of formal negotiation, out of which a very idiosyncratic kind of political ecology emerges over time. Takes a very long time. You go back far enough, this didn't exist. This all began to exist after the fall of Rome. Because Rome is a very traditional superstate, right? It rules everything there is, sine fine, right? Without borders, it claims everything it can lay its hand on. It reaches the Atlantic to Sahara, you name it. It expands as far as it can, pretty much. It lasts for a really long time, as big as China at the time. And, it's a traditional format, one that works well in pre-modern and agrarian history. And then it goes away. Well, empires fall all the time, right? They have a certain shelf life. They last a few hundred years. If they are lucky, think of the various Chinese dynasties and South Asia, Middle East, and Inca and Aztec, you name it. But usually in any part of the world where you had an empire at some point, it tends to come back. Not the next day. You may have to wait 50, 100, 200 years, but it will come back because there are certain environmental conditions in place or certain institutional legacies in place or whatever it is. It will come back one way or another under new leadership, but it will come back. Sometimes very often, like in China, sometimes intermittently, like in India or the Middle East, and sometimes never, like in Europe. Now, Europe, west of Russia, is the only part of the world where you had a very successful empire for a very long time, and then nothing for the next 1500 years, nothing comparable. So that's very strange. And my intuition was that those two things are related. Europe is unique in that respect. First big empire, then no big empire. And it's unique in terms of the modernizing divergence between European development and the rest of the world. And the intuition is, well, maybe these two things are related. As it turns out, you look at the various explanations given for the later divergence, they are all logically, meaningfully rooted in this kind of absence of universal empire. So everything is meaningfully rooted in the fact, not just that Rome fell, but that nothing like Rome ever came back.
Right.
And so people like to talk endlessly, as I'm sure you know, and your listeners will know about the fall of the Roman Empire. Why did the Roman Empire fall? There are hundreds of reasons, literally hundreds, that have been put forward in the literature for hundreds of years, going back to antiquity, in a way.
Laughs.
It's completely insane. Books are written every year, right? It'll never stop. That's fine. I have no dog in this fight. I think there's a more interesting question. Well, why did nothing like the Roman Empire ever come back? Once you have a big empire, there should be another one down the line. Doesn't happen. So that's what I look at in my book. That's a big part of it. Is Rome just weird? Shouldn't the Roman Empire have existed in the first place? Is it
Right.
anomalous on its own terms? Arguably. Was it repeatable? Why not? You have to look at the various factors. You have to develop counterfactuals,
Well, let's go back.
which,
Can I just stop you?
yeah,
Because actually, that's the next question I was
sure.
going to ask. Is reading through your
Very
book,
good.
I mean, you have so many reasons why you find so many geographical and economic and other reasons why Rome never reconstituted itself. So by a certain point, I think you say this yourself, but the reader starts to think the really weird thing is actually that Rome ever existed at all, that there was
Yeah.
ever a single kind of continent spanning empire in European history. So I guess one question, we could go into all your reasons why that was improbable, but I guess another big question is, and this is something that interested ancient authors like Polybius why did that actually happen if it was so unlikely? What was it about Roman civilization that meant that they could take over where all these other, civilizations, which on the face of it looked fairly impressive, like classical Athens, for example, like Alexander the Great, they never actually managed to sort of take over the whole of Europe or the Mediterranean.
Yeah, I think that's the key question. That's my beef with business as usual. Because if you're a regular Roman historian, you just study what happened. And that's the way it is. It just happened, and you look at the proximate factors that make this happen. But you never really step back and say, well, why did it happen in the first place? Maybe it shouldn't have happened. Look at what happened afterwards and so on. So I think that's very important for us to do. My answer is that Rome is also weird. It's not just the Greeks are weird, it's Rome is weird too, in its ability to suck people in, to corral them, to co-opt them for military service in a way that's not very costly, that's very effective. Rome is lucky in a way that cannot be repeated later on because it exists in a relatively underdeveloped part of Europe or the Mediterranean, the western half rather than the eastern half. Eastern half had been developed for a very long time, thousands of years, going back to Old Kingdom Egypt and the Assyrians and whatnot. The Western Mediterranean far less competitive in that regard, easier in a way for someone who can build up a large military coalition to take over Italy and then branch out into other territories and amass the resources necessary to take over the eastern half as well. This is something you can only do once, because once that has been done, the Western Mediterranean, Western Europe, Spain, France, all these places are firmly incorporated in terms of their military, political institutions and capabilities into a larger ecumeny that stretches from the Atlantic to India, in a way. And once that has happened, you can't make it unhappen, so to speak, right? So even if the Roman Empire goes away, you still get these connections and continuities. And anybody who tries to do the same thing later on will face an uphill struggle. You're not going to have the same beneficial conditions around them that they can exploit the way the Romans did. So it's there are two parts to the story: what the Romans did in terms of mobilizing lots of people for warfare, and what conditions were outside the Roman domain initially that were easy to exploit for this particular coalition. The mobilization capability doesn't come back till arguably the French Revolution, which is much later. And of course, by then, well, the European states are all very similar. And if one state has some kind of reform or innovation, the others are going to copy it within 5 minutes, and you get long-term balancing and stability, and you'll never end up with another big empire, which is the very short version of the last 200 years of European history, right? You can try, Napoleon tried, Hitler tried, ultimately doesn't really work.
Right, so this cultural similarity aspect is one part of your story because at certain points your book is quite polemical and seems to say, basically that the Roman Empire, the best thing or the most important thing it did for Western civilization was to fall. But actually, you're saying something a little bit more nuanced, which is that there is this cultural similarity. So I guess, would you see then that people who are interested, like me, I guess, in Western civilization, the Roman Empire was actually extremely influential in terms of the Latin language, in terms of Christianity, etc., on that, in terms of constituting what Western civilization was and what shape it took. And that's actually a little bit of a separate question to what impact did these things have on the breakthrough to the Industrial Revolution ultimately? Because I think in that story, then it's clear that, or it seems more clear that something like the Latin language would be sort of epiphenomenal. It's not going to get you the steam engine.
That's very true. So, I mean, Rome falls in the West in particular, it unravels, but it doesn't disappear. There are parts of the Roman Empire where it does, like Britain. If the former Western Roman Empire had developed the way Britain did after 400, it would be a very different situation because everything goes away. Cities go away, and Latin and Christianity and everything is just gone. It's as if the Roman Empire never existed. I know there are ruins and roads and stuff, but by and large, it's gone. That wasn't the case on the continent. You have, as you say, survival in elite circles at the very least, Latin, a common legacy, literary high culture legacy. There are massive transformations in people's daily lives, in a way, but there is some continuity at the more sort of up high culture end of the spectrum, and it carries forward for a long time. It provides some degree of cohesion that, in a way, hampers the intensity of post-Roman fragmentation. That's certainly true. Yes, there are competing states, but they still in a sense, quite literally speak the same language, at least in elite circles. They can communicate. They have a shared religious system, even though that, of course, also blows up over time, but it's still sort of a shared religious framework. There's a shared legal system increasingly with the revival of Roman law and so on. So arguably what we are looking at is some kind of Goldilocks scenario where you have just enough fragmentation to unleash competitive dynamics that are productive in the long term and innovative, but not too much. And you still have enough cohesion as well in the cultural sphere to allow sustained interaction between the different players in that system, exchange of ideas, people moving back and forth, which they do all the time, the persecuted intellectuals and minority groups that can go from A to B if they don't like it where they are. That's an important part of the innovation ecosystem as well, which would have been much more difficult if people had nothing in common, the way they did before the Romans came along. And people did speak 100 different languages in Spain and Gaul and various parts of Western Europe. There was very little they had in common. So in that sense, there is a meaningful legacy. I, of course, play up the fragmentation argument because I think it's reasonably novel. I think it is decisive in a way. And I think it's a valuable corrective to the usual lamentation about, oh, if only the Roman Empire had not fallen or had come back, everything would be so much better. That I think is demonstrably untrue. We just need to look at other parts of the world where empire did come back reliably. They did well in some phases, in some cases, you think of China, but they never had any transformative breakthroughs, and they weren't about to have them either, contrary to what you sometimes see in the modern revisionist literature.
It's a little bit of a counterpoint to your Stanford colleague Ian Morris's work on this, where in Why the West Rules for Now, where he talks about the rises in social development in Western Eurasia and in China. And in that story, it usually is a good thing to have big empires. You know, Western social development rises until the Roman Empire falls, and then there's a collapse. And that's kind of a bad thing for him. I mean, I guess your story is a lot more about fragmentation. Ian's talking more about geography. But for you, the fragmentation actually issues in sort of some kinds of cultural difference, right? So if you think about China and the West, which is what Ian focuses on, you have some really interesting chapters where you talk about differences in basically kind of willingness to go out and plant flags and start to trade abroad and to conquer. You talk about the famous expeditions of Zheng He, the eunuch Muslim Chinese admiral who did these massive expeditions that are much bigger and better equipped than Columbus's. And you talk about how, the Philippines is actually very close to China, but it's actually the Spaniards who are interested in conquering the Philippines. It's not so much China. So your story is a different one to Ian's in the sense that it is ultimately geographical, I suppose, because these geographical factors kind of influence the ultimate fragmentation of Europe and the continuing fragmentation of Europe. But you're able also to sort of make that issue in these cultural differences.
Yeah, the environment is immensely important, and most historians these days don't pay enough attention to it because they abhor any notions of determinism. It's not about determinism. It's about what shaped outcomes. Determination means 100% Calvinist, I don't know, predetermined. That's not the way history works. But the environment, the physical environment, geography, ecology play an enormous role in accounting for different outcomes in different parts of the world. But it's not everything, right? There are institutions which may themselves be a function of the environment or shaped by the environment, but they still have a life of their own, so to speak. And I think that's very visible in what you just said. I mean, it's not just the Philippines, it's actually Taiwan. It's probably not very diplomatic to say this in this day and age, but the Chinese have no interest in Taiwan up to the 17th century. And they only go there because there's some, Ming-friendly regime that the Manchu have to take out. And before that, there were the Dutch and the Portuguese in Taiwan, and there were no Chinese. And the Philippines is the same thing. And yet you have an empire with hundreds of millions of people. They could have taken the Philippines, they could have taken Indonesia, and they could probably have crossed the Pacific if they had really tried. The Japanese could have crossed the Pacific, south of the Aleutian Islands into it's, the weather is poor and so on, but it's perfectly doable. There was a flourishing civilization in the Aleutian Islands at the time. It's not an uninhabitable wasteland. People did this back, the last ice age. It's not really that hard to do. There's no interest. And yet it's striking that there are a million people in Portugal and they sail all around Africa and they sail literally around the world which is not something they should have been able to do. And yet they do because they're really committed to it. And they're really committed to it because they inhabit a very different environment, politically, institutionally, than someone who lives in a Chinese empire.
Right. So for Ian, I think ultimately one of the really important differences is just the brute geographical fact that the Americas are farther away from China. And that helps Columbus get to America. First, it's not just that, of course, it's also they set up this sort of trading triangle with slaves going from Africa.
Mm.
And, it basically gives a boost to the Atlantic economy. But for you, it's not just that. It's that, China wouldn't have been interested in crossing the Atlantic Ocean, even the sort of smaller Atlantic Ocean, if it had been if it had been separated from the Americas by just the Atlantic Ocean.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we can't prove that. You can never prove a counterfactual. But I did this in my book. I flipped Eurasia around northeast on its sort of northeast axis so that China faces the Americas across the Atlantic and vice versa. And there's no reason to believe, I mean, that the Chinese would have gone out into the sea. And we mustn't forget that the easiest way to cross the Atlantic is actually from West Africa to Brazil. That's the shortest route. There are decent winds. It's very easy to do. Nobody's doing it either, right? There's one story about a king of Mali who supposedly did this in 1300, but it doesn't seem to be true. At least there's no documentation. At least people had the idea in that environment. It might have happened at some point, but it's really the small scale guys, right? It's the Norse who, there aren't that many people in medieval Scandinavia, and yet they do it. It's like the Polynesians who crossed to Madagascar and to Easter Island, and as we now know, apparently all the way to South America based on genetic data
And to
have
New
come out in
Zealand.
recent years. Yeah, and New Zealand anyway. New Zealand is pretty close, right? But the entire South Pacific, it's an enormous space. So you don't need a big empire. It seems it's like the opposite. A different kind of actors, the small scale groups that are the most enterprising when it comes to, crossing wide oceans.
Okay, so we just told me you're not pro-disaster. That I was saying the Great Leveler kind of seems to suggest we should all have massive civilization-wide catastrophes. You said I'm not a proponent of disaster, but I would argue, Walter, you're a proponent of disaster because this book as well, the conclusion, the lesson that we might draw would seem to be if you have a big flourishing empire, destroy it and make sure it's destroyed in as thorough a way as possible. So there's lots of fragmentation, everyone's miserable, they're all competing to stay alive, and then you'll get economic growth.
Yeah, it seems to be a shared theme. I mean, as you said, Death on the Nile and the Great Leveler and Escape from Rome and all these things. I can't deny it. That's if I had to self-psychoanalyze, it's probably because I'm from Vienna and we are gloomy people and so on. So maybe I'm not. If I had been born in the US, I'm sure I'd be much more optimistic about these various things. But it is true. I mean, I think it's important to look at calamities or disasters in history where our first instinct is to say it's just unmitigated disaster, right? It can only have bad outcomes. And of course, there's immense suffering, and you don't wish this on anyone. But if you look at this, with a kind of detachment that I can afford because I haven't lived through any of those calamities, I look at this from my own long-term perspective, and all of a sudden you can see things differently, right? That there is something to be salvaged even from the biggest disasters. And it goes back a long way. I mean, if you think of the extinction of the dinosaurs, right, we wouldn't be sitting here talking about these things if there were still dinosaurs. Mammals would never have had the kind of career that we have had. So there are many disasters in history where there is light at the end of the tunnel and you get unexpected benefits at the end.
All right, so we got 5 minutes left. So last question. I know you've got a new book coming out or out already about ancient
Out
history
in April.
and how to do it and what it is. So let's go back to the themes we started with, really. Um, so what do you think about the field of ancient history at the moment, where it's come from and where it's going, and what do you think sort of should happen?
I guess I'm just a weird person because I didn't grow up in the classics tradition. I grew up in continental Europe. There is no classics. I did ancient history, which was part of a history department, and yet pretty compartmentalized. But still, I had a sense that my primary frame of reference was other history and not, ancient authors or digs and that sort of thing. Anyway, so that's my perspective. And then I moved to the Anglosphere a long time, 30 years ago, I guess, at this point. And everybody was doing classics. And I thought, well, it's not really my cup of tea, but, that's what I have to do. And I retained a healthy skepticism or unhealthy skepticism all my life. And a few years ago, I thought, well, I really have to, I'm becoming some kind of old fart. So now this is my chance to write about this and collect my thoughts, what I think is wrong with this picture and what should be done instead. And the idea is that when we talk about ancient history, first of all, it's a misnomer. When you say in English, that's ancient history, it means something is irrelevant or obsolete, right? It's not applicable anymore. Forget about it, in a way. I think it's the exact opposite, depending on how we define it. I think we should define ancient history more broadly, the kind of developmental phase at the beginning of the Holocene where things do change in response to changing environmental conditions. People settle down, they develop all the things that surround us, that are in our head still, in transformed fashion, of course. But the beginnings of all these things were developed in that period over thousands of years, and they shape our lives ineluctably. I mean, in a way, we can no longer escape. We are completely trapped in the creations of that period on a planetary scale. You have these developments independently in different parts of the world, across Eurasia and Africa, later in the Americas, where it's fully independent, of course, because of separation from the old world. And then it spreads outwards, not just for colonialism. That's just the very last step. I mean, these are processes that go back a really long time that make the planet more and more connected, uniform, and so on, that spread this ancient heritage all over. And now it controls everything. So antiquity, this kind of antiquity really has won in a way. That's what we have to live with. And that's why we should understand it for what it was, as a planetary scale process that has shaped everything that we now experience. It's not a matter of just narrow lineages from Greeks to Romans to the Western civilization or Confucius to modern China, you name it. That's part of the story, but it's only part of the story. It's a much broader kind of process. It's planetary, and we should do justice to it, not least because we live in a globalized world, right? It's incumbent upon us to do that, especially, but not only in the United States, which of course is a composite of people from all over the world who bring, in a way, their own roots, their own ancient histories into the bargain. And so we should, I think, redefine ancient history as a global phenomenon, not just something that's Greco-Roman. Nothing against Greco-Romans. They pay, my paycheck and all the rest of it. But that's not it. That's just the beginning, right? And then we have to figure out, well, why did this happen? We have a long chapter about history of scholarship, last 250 years, driven very much by what happened in Europe, late 18th century, 19th century. Not a pretty picture in some ways. We have to go into this. Well known. Have we fully transcended it? No. Is it possible? I don't know. We can try. What do we have to do? What kind of methods can we apply to globalize the study, the teaching of ancient history? An important element will be more collaboration, right? One person can't do it. It becomes very shallow, superficial. If individuals try to control everything, that's not possible. Well, in many other fields, people work together amazingly. In archaeology, people work together, right? Just historians don't often work together the way they should, especially historians that specialize in different times and places. So we need more of that. That would necessitate change in institutional incentive structures, the way universities educate, hire, promote, reward, punish, all the rest of it. So it's a can of worms. Once you start thinking about it, you have to
Yeah.
move in sort of
Oh,
outward circles, and more would need to change for that to happen. But you have
yeah.
to start somewhere. So that's the
Yeah,
idea.
absolutely. Last question, just because I can't resist. So I definitely agree with you that there's plural ancient histories and all of them have been influential. All of them are interesting. I mean, I was just in India and you can obviously tell there's been a huge influence of the classical Sanskrit culture on what India is now. Having said that, I mean, a lot of your work, as we've explored already in this interview, would seem to suggest that the Western path, or the Greco-Roman inheritance, even if it's just in the form of the Roman Empire collapsing, it has been kind of peculiarly influential. Maybe you could argue that was unjust, but it seems like a historical fact through a lot of these things we've been talking about, right? Through family structure, through Christianity, through the fact that it was actually in Europe and in England in particular where they happened to make the first breakthrough into industrial modernity.
I have no problem with that in principle, but when we make that claim, and especially the claim that this is rooted in the more distant, in the ancient past, I would like to see that systematic, I mean, truly well-founded systematic comparative work has been done to actually either confirm or qualify that particular claim, and not just to sort of pronounce these things ex cathedra, which, more often than not has been the case. if the whole globalizing project eventually leads us to some version of what you just said, that's fine with me. But I think we need to do the actual work first. And that's not something we have really done because of the compartmentalization of the different areas of specialization. We really have to come together and assess those things side by side globally, constructively to see what's common, what's special, what are the lineages of development, and so on. And in that respect, I think we're still very much at the beginning. So it's a big
Yeah.
challenge.
I totally agree with that. I mean, I think that a lot of the old stories that people used to tell about Western civilization were to a great extent like quite naive and quite sort of lazy. It was just sort of an assertion. Now, I actually personally think that it may be that some elements of that traditional story may turn out to be vindicated. I mean, I think that's one of the interesting things about Joseph Henrich's work, that it does actually put Christianity front and
Right.
center of the way Western civilization evolved. It just sort of does it properly, and he draws on lots of other people's work as well. So thank you, Walter, for this interview. Thank you for actually leading the way and putting ancient history on this more sort of methodologically solid footing.
Well, thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.